Welcome to Plato's Cave. I'm Jordan Myers, and I'm a master's student in philosophy at the University of Houston. You're listening to a reading group episode of the show, which means that in this episode I discuss political philosophy with two non-philosopher friends, Adam and Giffin, because philosophy shouldn't just be for philosophers. So, with that introduction, please enjoy our discussion of political philosophy. Okay, well, I mean, I'll put my cards on the table. I liked this paper. Well, it's not even really a paper; it's like a pamphlet. And I should say we're discussing Estranged Labor by Karl Marx, which was if I have this right, it was actually an unpublished manuscript of his that was later kind of discovered and aired. And that's why it differs in a lot of ways from the Communist Manifesto, because I think Engels, his kind of writing partner, didn't have a hand or as much of a hand in this.
This is very early Marx.
Yeah, 1844. So he's writing in Germany and coming out of the Industrial Revolution at that point. And apparently a lot of these kind of ideas show up in more developed form in the Communist Manifesto. So this one is, the Estranged Labor is very generalized. But
when did he move? When did he move to London? What year was that?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I thought that it would be usually we don't say this kind of stuff. I actually thought it'd be fun because Adam, you and I were talking about this when we decided what to do next as the paper, and we were both motivated by the concern of, there are like. There are popularizers of these kinds of topics like Jordan B. Peterson, who, and you and I are annoyed to no end at people who think that they understand either Marx or Marxism, which, I don't even think Marxism is like a huge, Estranged Labor is obviously, I can see how it founds the idea, but it seems pretty separable in a lot of ways from it. But you and I have no patience for the type of person who, without reading a word of Marx, will then go on to say, there's nothing right with Marxism, or, whatever. Like,
yeah, it's like a guy like, I actually have like less of an issue with a guy like Peterson talking about Marx if he's claimed to have read Marx. Like if he in fact has read Marx and then gives his opinion on Marx, that's fine. That's fine. But the issue is with the fans who listen to Peterson discuss Marx and then think that they themselves understand Marx. It's like, just read the paper. This was 10 pages.
10 pages.
It's 10 pages. Read the paper.
And it's 10 narrowly bordered pages. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You sit down and you can just kind of churn through this, especially if you're not making notes to do a podcast in 45 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like not... I don't know. I have a creeping suspicion that Peterson himself hasn't read much of Marx, because you'll notice that he never... You know how it's natural? We always do it. When you're critiquing or even discussing someone, you use their language.
Yeah, that's true. Good
Peterson
point.
never uses any language of Marx's.
That's a really good point, because it's like... once defining their terminology, you want to use their words when discussing them. Like we would never like discuss Strawson, but then not bring up reactive attitudes.
How could we? It's like impossible.
You would assume we hadn't read Strawson.
And we'd be making fundamental errors, as Peterson is wont to do, about like, it's not even how to critique people, but what they even said. It's a bit ridiculous. But that was, that is to say, we might follow this up with the Communist Manifesto. I guess it depends on the end of the episode, but we kind of wanted to know for ourselves, okay, what is Marx's idea of estranged labor and what do we think of it? So that's why we're reading this. And I don't know, a lot of this will come up, but especially for you and me, Adam, we're in a very strange transition period in our work careers and our work lives, right? So I know for me, this is probably the time where I might be most amenable to this paper, trying to leave a field that I think is deeply estranged and go into one that maybe has in philosophy, maybe has the best kind of bulwark against this problem. But we can get into that.
Sure. I do. Okay. I guess like before we kind of like hop into this paper, what did you guys actually think about? It's not just the writing style of this paper, but what did you think about Marx's ability to actually expand on any of his ideas?
In this
Like,
paper, it was poor. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think like, I don't know how you felt Giffin as well, but like, I felt like he would say things in an axiomatic way, but I almost wanted him to kind of like dive deeper in and kind of like defend that statement. But there weren't a lot of like defenses. There were a lot of like axioms of like, this is the way things are. And perhaps it was taken maybe a little more clearly, like in a scenario in which everyone was already privy to the conditions of that period. It was like, okay, well, this is just evidently true. But it's some things, I mean, we'll get into the paper, obviously, but I didn't think things were well substantiated. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I agree with the sentiment. I think the paper suffered from, some sort of issue. I don't know if it's just the fact that it was a, unpublished manuscript. I don't know if it was like the audience was very particular who he was writing to. I don't know, but I agree. Like it was flawed in a couple ways.
And also from 1844. So it's not, he wasn't submitting this to Mind or something, I mean, there's no,
that's true.
There's no peer review going into this. You kind of have to assume.
And we'll also get into this as well. And I'm just going to be like, once again, I'll put my cards on the table. I didn't understand every part of this paper either.
Yes.
Like there were points of it where I did read this paper twice, but there were paragraphs where I felt like I was required to fill in the details of what he meant. And I was able to kind of get an idea of like, okay, this is what he means, but it's actually not clear to me that's what he meant. So I don't know. And once again, like you guys have already said, possibly it's due to the fact that it's an unpublished manuscript, but I don't know. We can hop into it.
I think this reads a lot like what I imagine a letter. So if I wrote you guys an email or something about a topic that we had discussed before, and then that email surfaced 200 years later and it was read with no context, that's kind of what this reads like.
Yeah. Whenever I mentioned the audience, I kind of was like, I have to try to give it the benefit of the doubt. It's an unpublished, unknown audience. You can at least give it some slack. But I also, I guess we'll get into it as well. But I'm guessing Adam also agreed. I think I had some trouble with some of the fundamental ideas as well.
Yeah.
Here.
Okay. So it seems like we've got a good spectrum with thoughts about the paper and this could be interesting. It might even come down to how we interpreted things. So
that'll be huge.
Okay. So one kind of term to get on the table, because again, this was also a bit archaic and arcane with some of the terminology he uses, and it's probably germane to the time and all those caveats, right? So he is talking about, he uses this term dozens of times, political economy, right?
Yeah.
And I kind of had to look this up, but what I'm taking that to mean is the private capitalist ownership of property. Is that right, Giffin?
Well, political economy, I think, is fundamentally just an old way to describe economics. So it's even broader than that.
Okay.
But of course, the system that he's critiquing is the one of the formed, at this point, decently well-formed capitalist society.
Okay. So it would
you're basically correct. But the term political economy, it was just used by the early economists to describe the economy before the term economics came into early effect.
So it would be like if I wrote you an email and I referred to the market. There's many types of markets, but obviously if I'm referring to the market, I'm talking about the US market there or something, right?
Something like that. Yeah.
Okay. So
whenever if you just substitute political economy for either like capitalism or the like modern economics, like you'd get the same picture.
Yeah. So I take Marx's main point in this manuscript to be he's developing this concept of alienation and estrangement from the perspective of someone engaged in the vicissitudes of daily life in the political economy. And he, he lays out several ways in which workers have been estranged or alienated, which is to say kind of separated in a deep way from their labor and from the product of that labor in a way that he thinks is a really bad thing. And I don't really know that there's too much more summary that I need to say, because
I think you do, because I think he goes farther, right? Because he's challenging.
Oh, that's true.
The concept of private property in this paper as well.
Yes, although I didn't take that to be the main point of the paper, but maybe we just read it differently.
I think so, because that's how he concludes, where he talks about even if you were to equalize wages, you still are under a system in which people work almost in a collective capitalistic system. And he really does. We can get into some of the quotes but I think he says, like, at the basis, like, he starts saying, like, we presupposed private property, and he concludes saying, private property is ultimately an unfounded kind of detriment in society. Yeah. So I that's how I interpreted this. What did you think, Giffin?
Yeah. So I mean, hopefully we don't mind. This is a bit of a jump, but just one of the comments that it might help clarify for, all of us about the relationship of private, the importance of private property. He says, it therefore follows for us that wages and private property are identical. And then he later says in the same sentence, wages are only a necessary consequence of the estrangement of labor. So tying those two parts of a sentence together, he does critique it, like the concept of private property, clearly. I don't know that necessarily you would call the conclusion that, he's not screaming, private property is theft. But he is saying there's a serious issue, alluding to the fact that, that is a foundation that we have that needs to be critiqued.
I also think theoretically, the diagnosis of the problem is it doesn't entail the solution that he provides also, right?
Oh, certainly, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because I would hope so, because I found his diagnosis of the problem to be nearly perfect, but I wouldn't agree at all with his solution, right? So
I'm not. Yeah. Well, I guess do we want to go through this from the beginning?
I was going to say I'd actually like to maybe let's just focus on his diagnosis of a problem with society first, because
absolutely,
I don't know. I do think we're all going to be pretty quick to say, obviously, we shouldn't absolve the concept of private property.
Hold that thought.
Giffin comes out as Marxist. You're like communist.
Once I read Estranged Labor, I didn't read it, but I read the title.
Yeah. I read the title. Peterson style.
Exactly.
I'm pretty sure estranged meant strange. So
I read Strange Labor. Of course I did.
Strange.
It is very odd if you think about
it. Peterson fans applauding.
Yeah.
But no, let's
So this is almost hard. I mean, it's almost hard to kind of even get it on the table. He has this one part of his diagnosis of the problem is that he says the worker sinks to the level of a commodity. And moreover, the most wretched commodity of all, that the misery of the worker is an inverse proportion to the power and volume of his production, that the necessary consequence of competition is the accumulation of capital in a few hands, and hence the restoration of monopoly in a more terrible form, and that finally, the distinction between capitalist and landlord, between agricultural worker and industrial worker disappears, and the whole of society must split into two classes of property owners and propertyless workers. Now, so to even kind of separate it more than both his diagnosis of the problem and the solution, I might even be less interested, although it's still interesting, in his diagnosis of how we reached this problem, because he says it's like he kind of makes motions towards it's the idea that it's naturally resulting from competition or from capitalism. I don't even know that that's necessarily the case. Like I mean, I don't disagree with it, but I'm just not. I don't know that I'm in a position to really be able to dive into that debate.
If we want to dive into like how he got to these conclusions, we're going to have to read something other than Estranged Labor. I mean, the whole historical materialism is like what would need to be reviewed.
The only two texts that I was really thinking about a lot when I was reading this was the Bertrand Russell paper that we read, In Praise of Idleness, and this really, really good book that I read by David Graeber, Bullshit Jobs. I think I've told you guys about it in parts before, at least. So those were kind of percolating at the top of my mind. And I don't know what you guys focused on, but a big focus on me was just, okay, if we almost take like a blind snapshot of where we are now /1844, is his diagnosis of the problem an accurate one? And I very kind of like eerily thought, yes. It's kind of, he was prophetic in a lot of ways, I think.
Well,
yeah, I think,
I don't know if it was
Adam, go ahead, Giffin.
Well, I was going to say, I think it's less prophetic and more diagnostic, because at the time, this was certainly like very, very obviously here. Like,
that's true.
He didn't need to like predict much, right? You can critique Marx almost primarily based on his, failed predictions.
Let me revise my statement. It's eerie how much his critique still holds today.
Yes. That if that's your statement, then
yes.
To some extent. Now, the individual aspects of the diagnosis is where I think we're going to have disagreement. If it's, if we're just kind of like looking at it, like stepping way back and thinking to ourselves, is it true that, in the capitalistic system, labor is alienated, from the product of the labor and from, fellow man as a consequence? Like that seems about right. But he actually makes like 4 separate points, some of which seem to rely on things that I don't know that I agree with.
Yeah.
And then secondarily to that, I'm not sure. Adam, do you want to?
No. I didn't know there was a second part to that thought. Go ahead.
Yeah, no. The second part, you can definitely talk next. I was just gonna kind of summarize here my overall thoughts. So the second part was, I don't know. I'm actually not entirely sure if he's saying this is the problem or this is like a problem, because he doesn't really take the perspective of like, there's no trade-off analysis or like, or even just like not even like lip service to the idea of, an actual like, cost benefit analysis, or just, just deciding whether,
of course,
he's basically saying like, this is a problem. I mean, naturally almost like he's saying, he's not saying consequences be damned. He's like, he's holding up this, like the idea of the estrangement of labor as like just an evil, right? Like it's like a sin against the idea of mankind, right? Anyways, Adam, you had some thoughts as well. I'm sorry.
Well, it's just like, I feel like with this paper, if we want to do this properly, I want to go through, like, like Jordan just read that little section right there. I want to like actually analyze what he's saying here, because I'm not sure I agree with that. Because because Jordan read that the misery of the worker is an inverse proportion to the power and volume of his production. Like that part right there.
I don't think that rings true in all cases. Yeah.
Well, it's like I get the concept where it's like, okay, say you're an Amazon worker and you're someone who's working 70 to 80 hours a week. Like the more hours and the harder you work doing a job you don't like, which he expands on later in the paper, it's the fact that you're unhappy while you're doing it. Of course, that's going to lead to misery, right?
Yeah.
But I guess like the thing I'm wondering about based on what you just read there is there's this dichotomy that he kind of brings about where you've got the property owners and propertyless workers. And I feel like that was really true, like in like the 1840s, right? Where you had, factory workers and management.
Yeah.
But I just wonder now, doesn't there seem to be more of like a gradient now where it's it's couldn't you be in upper level management, but you're not necessarily, you don't own a significant, part of the company, but I'm not sure that your work is necessarily miserable at that point. You are a worker, but you're not really a property owner. But I wonder how much this holds today.
Yeah. Jordan, I had a quick question. Where was this quote taken from? What page? Because
I read
the comment.
First bottom of the first paragraph. Yeah, it's very much like an introductory quote, and it's he takes a big swing with it because it's an introductory quote.
Okay, well, maybe we should just go through it past like the introduction, because I did have some specific comments, but it would probably be more appropriate at a time where he lays out like distinctly his four like critiques. Yeah. Because I do have a comment about that. I think I had a different interpretation, I guess, from what you interpreted it to mean.
All right, well, in the second paragraph here, like if we look at what he hops into next here, he says political economy proceeds from the fact of private property. So we can kind of substitute in, the economics kind of largely defined by capitalism proceeds from the fact of private property. It does not explain it. It grasps the material process of private property, the process through which it actually passes in general and abstract formula, which it then takes as laws.
And then it does not comprehend these laws, is like the next part, which I think is important. To me, this kind of made sense. Basically, the current system we have was allowed through our innovation of private property, which is distinct from like a natural phenomenon. It was created, but its existence doesn't justify itself, is what I took this to mean, which is fair enough.
Yeah, I actually totally agree with that, because like I like how the next line you just read there actually clarifies that, where it says it does not like show how they arise from the nature of private property. So it's like, okay, assuming private property, you don't get capitalism necessarily from the assumption of private property. It doesn't necessarily arise from that. So, so I agree with that.
Yeah. Like, so as we move into like, the individual parts of alienation, I do think, there is like there's like a Peterson-esque way that someone could read this, where it's like, okay, I think Marx is making a ubiquitous claim, and one that's like you can't find an exception to. But then if you're reading Estranged Labor like that, it's obviously going to be wrong, right? Like I didn't take Marx in a whole way to be saying like this is how it must be and there are no exceptions to it, but rather saying, because you're right, Adam, like a lot of the ways in which society has developed have created, I think, exceptions, but also importantly gradations of all of these problems. And like to point to, I'm obviously not accusing you of this, but I was just saying like there's like a Peterson-esque way to critique this, where it's like counterexample and then falsify where it's like, well, yeah, like some people have escaped this problem, but it's like, whoa, that doesn't mean the problem doesn't exist. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Yeah.
So okay, I've got one thing, and then to be honest, we can skip into where he starts with we'll start out from present day economic fact, because that's where I think it really starts to get interesting.
Yeah, he uses kind of some like rhetoric, so we can skip to like the important parts of like the proposal or the premises or the theory.
So this is on page 2 of our manuscript, which I'll link in the description. I forgot to say that. So okay, I don't know. I kind of had to stop myself from writing down examples that either from my personal history or like people I know, or like just kind of things that I'm aware of. Right. So he starts off by saying, so let's start from a present day economic fact. And this was a little bit of what I was talking about, where if he's like, okay, screenshot here, what is wrong? Not necessarily like how has it gone wrong or how should we fix it, but just first like snapshot of what is wrong. And he says the worker becomes poorer the more wealth he produces. the more his production increases in power and extent. The worker becomes an even cheaper commodity the more commodities he produces. Continuing, labor not only produces commodities, it also produces itself and the workers as a commodity, and does so in the same proportion in which it produces commodities in general. So this reminded me of the Russell paper, where I don't remember his example, but it's like if a worker invents a better way, or he figures out a better way to make bowls, he is going to make more bowls, and thus he kind of almost devalues himself, because there's still one of him, but there's like X number more of bowls or whatever, right? Or Russell makes this point where if if some line worker on like in an Apple plant or whatever, like figures out a way to like make this one part of an iPhone quicker, he's not actually going to, if he makes 50% more, he's not going to work half the time. He's going to make double the parts and still work the exact same amount of time. So like this leads to the next quote, where he says that like the effort or the work, it creates creates the product, and it's viewed as an input itself, because we care about the product, so it makes the work and thus the worker a mere input. They're a means to an end, and that is where kind of the basis of estrangement and alienation comes, and he lays it out in the next paragraph. Or sorry, someone about to say something?
I was just thinking about that. I mean, I once again, it's like, I don't want to get trapped in the idea of like thinking of exceptions with these things, right? It's just, I'm thinking like, is this an accurate view? Like if you become an efficient Amazon worker, are you devaluing yourself? Because, I mean, at that point, there is greater value in what you're doing. Therefore, you'll be recognized for the value that you are, producing for the company. You might get a promotion.
Yeah.
Might escape that menial work. I guess.
So you're critiquing specifically the idea of like the inverse proportionality.
Yes.
Like the more you work. So at first blush, I think those critiques make sense that you're giving at him. But I think what he's actually doing here is like these statements only make sense after applying what he says in like the next couple pages, where he defines like what he means, like what constitutes the actual loss. I think what he's saying here, this is what I meant to say before, is and this is like part that's kind of unclear, so I might be totally off base. But I think he's saying like the fact, like we can learn this later, the fact that it is, alienating is the negative that is entailed with labor. And so it's just a very straightforward relationship. If you work more, you get more of that negative thing. So it's not really a proportional kind of, it's more like, because there's a negative thing associated with this, doing more of this gets more of a negative thing. That's how I kind of interpreted it. But that was only after kind of filling it back in, right? Because it's not clear right off the start of this, which is kind of unfortunate, because we shall start off from a present day economic fact is kind of like, well,
yeah, I get what you're saying there. Like, I understand that,
so at the very least, it was confusing. At worst, I think he's, wrong. At best, he's just, misordered.
Wait, can I actually ask something real quick before we continue? I kind of forget. Can you guys, this is just for me, what, because like I had a couple of those classic shitty just like labor jobs in high school and everything. Like I had that one job where I was stalking like people? just yeah, so I was working for Epstein. No, I was like stocking supplies at like that pet store, and I worked at the ice cream parlor. And I mean, even before that, like I mowed grass and stuff. And then in college, I had a couple more like office jobs. And one of those was really good. The one I had like in later college. And then now I have just like, a regular industry job, classic desk engineering work job. But like, I honestly can't remember your guys' work history with that.
I mean, I worked at the bakery.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
I did construction work. I worked at 2 restaurants.
Oh, that's
I've
right. Yeah.
I delivered pizza at a pizza place, and I did like that little painting gig. And
That was criminal-esque.
yeah, that was literally the worst thing I ever did, and I only lasted a
It
month.
was like a summer.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and um, just worked for my dad. And
Just
did
yard work and
this,
stuff.
oh,
Yeah.
and then like the when I worked in the lab for a year.
That's right. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I've also had some, menial jobs. I worked in kitchens as a lot attendant for a car dealership, um, at a grocery store as well.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
So,
Forgot
yeah,
about that second one.
and then also in a lab setting, that's what I do now. But
You know what's
yeah,
interesting? Because I was thinking about this with respect to like me a lot, obviously, because like everyone does. Yeah, it's interesting to keep in mind. So there's a way in which a lot of really, really basic jobs, like a lot of the ones that we had, are very straightforwardly analogous to the classic, just like factory worker job. And then there's kind of that tier above it where it's
yeah.
in a lot of ways what not as much you, Adam. You're actually an interesting case with respect to this, but
I would say so too, because a lot of the things I've
yeah,
done,
with the tutoring companies, like that's different actually.
Yeah,
and I think
yeah.
I wonder if kind of genealogically that's why you liked this a little bit less. It seems
That's very possible.
I'm actually wondering.
he critiques the bourgeoisie.
Well, no, that's not even like, because I'm actually interested. One of the reasons why I was so interested to talk to you guys is like I feel like I am target number one for this paper, and I suspected that Adam wouldn't be able to relate a lot to it because of where you are now.
I didn't relate a lot to this.
So that okay. What
Yeah.
I really want to talk to you guys about is I think that there's been this like actually very sinister and obsequious twist to what he's been talking about with a lot of those mid-level jobs, right? Because there's a way in which the really, really basic shitty jobs are a lot like the factory ones, and a way in which a lot of the managerial CEO jobs are a lot like the factory owners. But there's this weird, and I mean, obviously I have a bunch of notes on this and everything, but there's this weird way in which all of those middling jobs, like the office engineer, the architect, like the dentist, well, the dentist is actually a little bit closer, like manual labor, just like a software programmer, all of those kind of jobs, they on their face look like they escape a lot of these things. But I actually wonder if in a very backhanded and twisted way, they succumb equally, if not more, in some certain ways to these. But I want to get to those, but I don't know. I'm very interested to hear, Adam, your reaction to what maybe like I'll have to say about those middling jobs.
Yeah, I mean, I've never worked one of those.
I know,
right?
which is weird, actually. Like that's a weird. Like if you do just like go straight through law school and succeed and everything, and you miss that weird middle portion, I think you're going to be among
heavily critiqued by Jordan.
Well, I think you're going to be among like 1 or 2% of the population who's never had one of those middling level jobs. Sorry, that's a huge over. You're going to be part of 1% of people who end up in the top echelon who haven't experienced the middle, because obviously the majority of people never even reach that middling portion, because like most of the economy is still truckers and like service people and all that kind of stuff,
Sure.
But
so I'll have to keep that in mind too. I'm just not in a position to, sympathize with every point being made here.
Of course.
So
okay, back to the text. So he says in the paragraph after the one I quoted, this is where he really gets kind of the idea of estrangement or alienation off the table. He says, this fact simply means that the object that labor produces, its product, stands opposed to it as something alien, as a power independent of the producer. Continuing on, this realization of labor appears as a loss of reality for the worker, objectification as a loss of and bondage to the object, and appropriation as estrangement, as alienation. So that is where he roughly, to say the least, defines what he's talking about by estrangement or alienation, where there's this separation of the person from the, and this is the first level because he gets into more, but there's this separation and almost an adversarial relationship that develops between the person and his work, right? And like I said, because it's almost, he goes on to talk about this, but because what matters is the effort, the person is viewed as almost an input. They're a source of that effort. They're not actually an end in and of themselves. They're like a means to that end. And that's a way in which you're alienated from your labor.
I kind of read that similar too, in the sense that kind of the show goes on either way, because it's like this fact simply means that the object that labor produces, its product, stands opposed to it as something alien, as a power independent of the producer.
Yes.
So it's almost like if you're viewing it, if you're viewing labor as an input, it's not any specific person, because you can be replaced by any other specific input.
Yep.
So you make up a simple input in the production of an object. So
the obvious way in which that's true is no one cares who or how the shelf gets stocked as long as it's stocked by the time the store is open, right? But what I was talking about before is there's also a very sinister and underhanded way that take engineering as like the field, for instance. No one really actually cares who makes the design or how they make it. All that matters at the end of the day is that the product is functional and that it makes profit for the company. It actually doesn't. Intrinsic in the product is not that I made it versus someone else. And this is the part that actually I think is bad about that middling level. That's not the case for the lower level. When I create a successful design, it sort of, in like an almost ex machina way, becomes an entity in itself. As soon as I create something, that product has power over me now because I'm responsible for it. Right? It's like, as soon as I create, if I create like a new product for a company and I was the engineer behind it, I am now subservient to the maintenance of that product, securing the raw materials to make it. You actually create your own. He makes a lot of like analogies to religion, but it's true. Like, you create your own God and then you're forced to serve it in those middling level jobs. And I think that's a danger to the middling level jobs in a way that is not present in the lower level ones. Obviously, not to say that I wouldn't. I would not rather be packing shelves, obviously, but
and I get what you're saying too. Like, I'm just thinking about it right now, because I understand that, like, if you were involved in a project that produced something that was highly, profitable for the company, suddenly that object is much more important than you.
Yes,
like that's without a doubt true.
This episode is going to be heavily edited, obviously, but look, like, for real, this part will get cut. If I were to create a new design in a circuit breaker, that thing fucking owns me now. Like, if I were to create a totally new circuit breaker, that would be one of the worst possible things I could do, for real. Because, like, what would happen is I would not have any of my current responsibilities lifted from me. What would happen is I would have an additional one added to me. Like, it goes back to the Russell point. No one ever gets freed of anything. You just maintain or get things added on to you. And then there's that way in which, when you climb the ladder, and like Marx doesn't explicitly go into this, but honestly, like, when you get farther and farther away from those responsibilities or that creation, you just get alienated in like a completely different way. Like, managers at companies like this, they exist in this state where they're not actually doing anything, really. I mean, they're not like doing anything in a rewarding way.
They're taking the heat from the lower laborers for the company.
Kind of. I mean, usually the heat just gets blasted down on the people on the front lines. You know what I mean? It's like that. So, well, I guess this naturally goes to the next paragraph. He says, work itself becomes an object which he can only obtain through an enormous effort and with spasmodic interruptions. So much does the appropriation of the object appear as estrangement that the more objects the workers produce, the fewer he can possess, and the more he falls under the domination of his product of capital. So, like, dude, this rang so true to me because the what he's saying, I took him to be saying, is the worker themselves, they even start to care about the work, not the product. It's like, so you don't even do things because they make sense to do, or because you want to do them, or because you think the outcome is going to be good, but because you have to work. Like, because we're so dependent on work for the rest of our lives. I mean, dude, even like fucking health insurance in the US is connected to your job, right? Like, you actually start to not care about the reasonableness of the work. You just work. So it's like it's a further alienation from your rational capacities almost. It's like this doesn't make sense, but I have to work. So it's just and I don't know, like anyone who's had an office job can relate to, you can't, even if you go and like so many things don't make sense, you can't raise all of those things because no one's going to want to fix them. So then it's like, what do you do in that scenario? Well, you have to collect this paycheck. So you just buckle down and work. Because that's kind of the first part, because he's about to move to the second one. I don't know if we have any more thoughts about the first part.
Just briefly, like reading through this, once and twice, I kind of understood generically what he was kind of aiming for, but it didn't really resonate with me, like the kind of specific things he was saying for this part. Even though I feel like I would be a target of this, I feel like perhaps.
Wait, you don't relate to any of those things?
I mean, it depends. Like in some regard, yeah, but I don't like. It seemed like kind of narrative, like what he was describing here, and it wasn't like strictly tied or entailed by what he had claimed previously. Like whenever you were, explain, like, do you care a little bit less about the object whenever you're working, like because it's just for sustenance? Like, yeah, like I think that's completely natural, but I'm not sure that's that's all that he was trying to say in like the paragraphs.
No, I don't think it was either.
And I'm not sure I understand it like fully still. Like the first part of like I understand of that paragraph. Like so much does the realization of labor appear as loss of reality that the worker loses his reality to the point of dying of starvation. Totally agree. So much does objectification appear as loss of the object that the worker is robbed of the objects he needs most, not only for life, but also for work. I think I understand that one, but it moves into this, and I'm not sure I understand him. Work itself becomes an object, okay, fine, which he can only obtain through enormous effort and with spasmodic interruptions. Totally agree, but it's this final sentence.
Okay.
So much does the appropriation of the object appear as estrangement that the more objects the worker produces, the fewer he can possess, and the more he falls under the domination of his product of capital.
Can I take a swing at it?
Sure.
Yeah.
I may agree or disagree.
Okay, I think this is what I was talking about. So when he says an appropriation of the object, that means, again, so the object is the work again. And that's what I was talking about before, where the work is viewed as an input, right? And it's appropriated by people above you. Now, that begins to appear as estrangement because the more someone produces, the less he can possess. What I think he means by that is what I was talking about before, where if you, and I actually think that this rings more true to those middle level people than the lower, but basically like when you do your job well and you create sort of new products or new tools or new ways of doing things, you you actually possess control of those things less because they domineer over you. He falls under the domination of his product, of capital. So when you make a company money in like really perverse set cases, I guess, I don't know if they're the majority or whatever, but when you make something new for a company, you lose dominion over that and it dominates you. So that's how you possess less and less of the product. You're not in control of any of it.
Yeah, I think that's the part that's hard to relate to.
Yeah,
maybe if I produce like specific designs of a product that I can like materialize in front of me, it might be a little bit different. My line of work isn't quite like that.
Mm-hmm.
But like I don't. Well, it's hard to relate to that sense of falling under the domination of my product.
And Adam, you're. I mean, like running your own tutor company is like is anathema to all of this. It doesn't even because you're actually. Marx talks about this in the Communist Manifesto. You're actually more like you existed in like much more of the feudal state in a good way because you're like a tradesman almost. Like he talks a lot about like tradespeople. Because you handle every part of what you're doing. So there's no alienation because you're not sort of outsourcing things. You're not, but also importantly, and I think this comes up a lot in the next section, but like a huge aspect of work is the fact that you don't control a fucking ounce of it. Like is this in the next part? Because Yeah. This is like the next.
Jordan, but here's my thing, though. Thing. Everything you're saying makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
My only question is this:
is that what he's saying?
Yeah, I'm not. That's exactly my point. I'm not actually sure that what he's saying is what you just said.
Okay.
Okay. So and that's not because I disagree with you. It's just that I read that sentence, I hear your spiel. And I'm saying, yeah, I think that makes sense.
Checks out,
but then I read it again, and I'm like, I'm actually not sure that's what he's saying. Like, I'm
okay. Wait,
it doesn't map on.
For my edification, what else could he be saying there? Because I can only read it through my lens. You know what I mean?
I mean, so that the more objects the worker produces, the fewer can he possess. I just wasn't sure if that's with respect to. Say he is now putting greater hours into his work, and like he later expands on this, that the more one puts into your work, the less of he is himself, right?
Yeah.
Like so he's unable to have kind of dominion over things outside the sphere of work if he puts more of himself into his work. So then he falls under the domination of his work at that point, of the product, of capital. So I'm not sure if this is like kind of a juxtaposition with respect to the more he puts himself into his work, the less he has outside of it. Versus like within the work itself, you're describing a situation that, you develop this new circuit breaker or whatever.
Yeah.
And then that suddenly becomes, in a sense, you can almost like, I can almost like imagine like at your work, like what if like your other tasks dropped off and suddenly that was your sole priority and
you never get to work yourself out of stuff. You never do. Yeah,
exactly. So I can see your point there. I'm just not sure exactly what he's talking about here. Like,
I actually liked your other interpretation though. Like I think it's also true. Right.
Okay. I just
the life being kind of consumed.
Yeah.
Outside work.
And that comes up in the next section a lot, I think.
Yeah. But
it's just unclear about if that's what he's saying.
That's like, that's my point though. Like, I don't disagree with like the ideas. It's just like, I'm never sure exactly what he's talking about with a lot of this stuff. So,
yeah, I honestly, I think that the value of this is not in
the specifics.
Yeah. I would never cite this as claim Marx 1844. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know that that's where the value of this comes in. This is a postmodern-esque claim that I rarely make, but I honestly think the value of these kinds of things are in the eye of the beholder. Like, I just wonder if, I don't know. Because the other thing too is we're bringing an an ahistorical context to this in that we're interpreting it today. And he obviously couldn't have foreseen all of the ways in which this would be true or false today. But like I said, some of this most fucked up thing about this is there are ways in which it's more true or more sinisterly true in some ways. Do we want to go to the next section where
Sure. Let's do that.
Okay. So he says, let us now take a closer look at objectification, which he defines as the production of the worker, and the estrangement, which he defines as the loss of the object of his product that this entails. So, okay, I kind of took him. Maybe what I'll do is I'll read 2 paragraphs and I'll say what I thought they meant, and then we can. I want to hear your guys' interpretation. So these are the second and third, or third and fourth paragraphs, if you count that snippet of the first on page 3. So he says, the more the worker appropriates the external world, sensuous nature, through his labor, the more he deprives himself of the means of life in 2 respects. Firstly, the sensuous external world becomes less and less an object belonging to his labor, a means of life of his labor. And secondly, it becomes less and less a means of life in the immediate sense, a means for the physical subsistence of the worker. So I took the first part to be kind of saying that you don't work with you don't work with the world as a whole. This is the problem with specialization. You focus on smaller and smaller and smaller parts. And this is what I was talking about. Like, you can't understand this, Adam, in your current position, because the best thing about your the tutoring gig is you own all of it. So you control all of it. But when you work for a massive corporation or some shit, or you're on the factory line in 1844, you're probably doing, and actually the interesting thing is that this problem has actually probably worsened since 1844, where you're doing a more and more and more specific thing. I would be willing to bet that most people on any given production line, 99% of people on any given production line, do not know how their part works with respect to the entire vehicle, with the entire phone, with the entire all they know is their one part and where it fits in, and that's it. And so you're carving nature up into just tinier and tinier pieces. And I took the second part to be saying the problem is that you're not actually engaging in the production of your own. I mean, this comes up more in the manifesto, I think, but you're not actually engaging in the production of your own things, your own food, your own shelter, your own resources. You're actually disconnecting in a narrower and narrower kind of slice, or you're going down a deeper and deeper hole where you only think about specialization in today's world. People, I mean, Adam, you and I have said this to each other before. You can live a middle-class life and know almost nothing about anything. Because you can get TurboTax to do your taxes. You can just buy everything online. You show up to your job and you only have to know how this one component fits within these other. It's you don't have to know anything. Whereas before, I feel like this sounds Pollyannish, but you actually had to be a more well-rounded person previously.
To work in a factory?
No. I'm talking before Marx. You had to know multiple crafts. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
And
I agree with that.
And I'm not glorifying it, because obviously there are many, many, many ways in which I'd rather live in today's society, but that's not one of them.
If you were a farmer, I mean,
yeah.
Even if your knowledge domain was purely in farming, it's a pretty big knowledge domain, to be honest.
It's a huge knowledge domain.
To have an understanding of weather and seasons and
And I have a friend's girlfriend whose family owns their own farm still. They're wheat farmers in Oregon. Dude, it's the coolest thing ever. I mean, they live out in the middle of nowhere. There's hardly any cell reception, and they do everything. And it's so cool. It's so antiquated, been a very, cool style.
Yeah, you have to be very knowledgeable.
Yes.
To run a farm. Yeah.
And those people don't know anything about computers. They don't know anything about economics, but they know so much more than the average person about like many, many things.
Yeah. I agree with that.
Do you want me to read the next paragraph?
Yeah, read the next one because I do have a few questions about that. Exactly.
Okay. Okay. He continues, in these two respects, then, the worker becomes a slave of his object. Firstly, in that he receives an object of labor, i.e., he receives work. This is where, I mean, he had me, I was like supple clay in his hands at that, because I'm going to pause and explain that part first. Well, no, I'll continue. And secondly, in that he receives means of subsistence. Firstly, then, so that he can exist as a worker, and secondly, as a physical subject. The culmination of this slavery is that it is only as a worker that he can maintain himself as a physical subject, and only as a physical subject that he is a worker. Okay, I was just like swooning at this point, because I think, if I'm reading him correct, he's pointing out that, like, holy shit, before, like I was talking about, when you own a farm or something, you actually interacted directly with resources, with the land, with your product. And there's a ton of issues with that, right? But now you're given tasks to do, and you're rewarded with money as a surrogate for actually working with resources and transforming those resources into a value. You're alienated from all of that process at this point, because you literally, if you work in an office job, it's fucking crazy to put it in, like, this is your life. You go to work, you open up your computer, you receive emails that tell you what you're going to do and when. You complete those tasks without the requirement that you understand where they fit into the larger company scheme at all. And then you get a direct deposit every 2 weeks. That is your entire life for 40, 50, 60 hours a week. Like, you are alienated or estranged from the vast majority of not only what you could be doing, but what you actually do.
Yeah, I actually don't disagree with any of that there. I especially liked the language that you pointed out there too, like the he receives work.
I love
because I definitely like the phrasing there, which I still find to be true. I mean, obviously, I don't have a job like that now. I go out and get my own work.
You're a farmer.
I don't actually receive work from anyone.
I know.
I seek out, work that I want to do.
And dude, this is why I want to go into philosophy. Like, no one tells me what paper to write. You couldn't even do that. It doesn't even make sense. Like, I think being a professor generally, but honestly, just even a philosophy professor specifically, is like, that is a current day job that has escaped a lot of these issues, I think. And obviously you have to do committee work, and you have to, it's a job. You have to do certain aspects of it that are not super fun. But like, the core aspect of the job that allures me so much is it escapes a lot of these issues. I don't know.
And I think there's a lot of jobs that
being a lawyer can be a lot like that. I was thinking.
I was thinking that too, and even just like having a trade.
Yeah.
Knowing carpentry or like plumbing or whatever. I mean, you go out and people will contact you obviously and say like, hey, I need this done, but ultimately it's up to you.
You can accept the clientele or not.
Yeah, exactly. It's up to you. So
this is what I was talking about, where there are sinister ways in which the middle realm of people actually are estranged and alienated in ways that the lower class aren't.
Yeah, it's like there is an out to like these horrible situations, like, because people always kind of define it as like, okay, well, you're either working for someone or you die. It's like, well, you can in fact work on your own if you have something marketable.
Yes.
Giffin, what do you think about this here?
I don't know. So when I first read like the paragraph we're talking about, like in these two respects, like I generally think I agree. But I mean, the caveat to this is like, it's like, yeah, like it's while you're working, it is true that like only as a worker can he maintain himself as a physical subject, and only as a physical subject that he is a worker. But it doesn't necessarily destroy the prospect of him, being a worker in the right way, right? Just not during time when he's employed.
Well, that's the jab that he sets up for the overhand right that's coming next. But like, even, I mean, but you, I don't think you're not saying you disagree that I think that this statement is undoubtedly true. The vast majority of jobs succumb gravely to that issue that he's pointing out.
Specifically,
that one receives work and then receives means of subsistence instead of actually having any true interaction with the product.
It depends on like the interaction part, but I mean, generally, yeah, I agree. I mean, it's clear that it's a system where, labor is, the input, and then the output is, money, which can be used for, it needs to be used for subsistence. I mean, yeah, like I don't disagree with like what you're saying. I guess it's just another fact of like, I just am reading through this and I'm not 100% sure if that's what is being said by Marx or meant by Marx. If it's all you're saying is like, yeah, it becomes, drudgery, like, and the alienation is clear. But I just don't see it as, I mean, he treats it like the alienation part as like a grave sin. And I think it has negative consequences. But I don't know. I feel like I'm at least thus far in the paper, it's just like hasn't hit yet,
I think I agreed more with the second paragraph that Jordan read, and I understood the first less. I wouldn't say I disagree, but I understood it less. Like,
I think that's fair.
I mean, I okay, maybe this should be off the air, but
I've killed a man recently.
No, I mean this is kind of embarrassing. I was 99.99% sure coming into this paper I understand what the word appropriate means. But could we define that? That means to kind of to like, appropriate a culture, or means to kind of like take as one's own, right?
Yeah.
So the more the worker takes the external world as one's own.
Wait, where are you saying that?
Yeah, where's the quote?
It's in the previous paragraph.
The more the worker appropriates the external world. Okay, yeah. Okay,
I guess I just don't understand this as much. Like, I mean, so like the more he takes the external world as his own.
This is basically like the previous two sentences.
I think I got this because Marx uses appropriates. He uses it in two different ways and he doesn't specify, I think. I could be way off on this because this is a really narrow point where he's saying like the worker is sort of, instead of appropriates, like the worker is sort of a parasite on the external world. Like we're churning it up into things, right? And there's two ways that you can do that. Like there's the way of the farmer, which is you're actually manipulating. This is what we're talking about, like the knowledge base, right? You can actually manipulate resources to create something of value. But then there's another way, this alienated way, where you're still churning up kind of resources and you're creating things, but you don't have that same control, that same understanding, that same input as the tradesman. But then he goes on later in the paper, I think, to use appropriates as, or maybe he's already done it. Then he talks about labor or work being appropriated from the worker. So he uses it in two different ways in the paper, and he doesn't really make that clear. Does that clarify at all? Or am I like, do I seem
well? I think it makes sense. This paragraph still remains a little confusing to me.
Yeah, your explanations are always like, okay, I never disagree with what you're saying. I'm always just wondering, like, is that what he's saying?
Yeah.
Because like I
don't know.
I'm just reading this because I'm wondering how broad this term external world is here, where it's like, okay, is the external world just kind of the world as interpreted by your senses based on the sensuous nature comment there? Or it's like, okay, so therefore the external world as you perceive becomes less and less an object belonging to your labor because you are less and less capable of manipulating the world.
Yeah, I think
like
he's
that
definitely
too.
referring to the material world here, based on like 2 paragraphs back, where it is the material in which his labor realizes itself. And then he says sensuous nature. To me, he's basically describing. I mean, what I took it as is, because through this system, he loses, the object of his labor through his through the labor, which requires like materials, right? The external world, you kind of lose that as well. It's kind of like it's almost another point of perspective.
You have to have a Marxist reading of Marx.
I don't think I understood any of that. I mean, like, I feel like,
I think it's describing the relationship between the material world and yourself, and how it's changed whenever you don't have access to the object of the labor. So it's not the object. It's not just the object that you lose. It's like the relationship with the entire world because of the materials required. That's how I read it.
Do you think this is it, or is this getting at a separate point? So the second and third, fourth, fifth lines, those bulleted lines, the second line, he says, the more value he creates, talking about the worker, the more worthless he becomes. And the fifth line is, the more powerful the work, the more powerless the worker.
Yeah, if the value of his work in that case is very high, he is almost like kind of held bondage.
He's like less free. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's not it's ultimately not really within his capacity to stop doing that work if the work is that important.
Yeah.
So, and I guess we can go over some of like these little bullet points here, but I don't know how much.
I even thought we could just move on to the next section. Yeah.
They're either synonymous or completely rhetorical.
I definitely, okay, but here's one I liked though. Let me go over one I liked the very least. I liked the one, the more civilized his object, the more barbarous the worker. I mean, think about how good that one is, right? I mean,
that's so good.
No, enlighten me, because I actually don't understand that at all.
Well, I think let's talk about Marx's period for a second, right?
Sure.
Think about in the mid 1800s. Imagine they were just producing some of like those earliest, almost like animatronic dolls. You know how like some of like those. There were those almost like robotic dolls that kind of shocked people in the mid 1800s.
Sure.
That some of like, it was kind of the burgeoning technology of the period.
Yeah.
But think of like what an interesting and, technologically, profound thing being produced, and then kind of juxtapose that to the people just like working in the factories, losing fingers and just working long hours of the day to produce.
Covered in soot.
Yeah. No, I don't disagree with that.
But almost like, but what if you, isn't that juxtaposition more barbarous than if they were just producing, say, toilet paper?
Yes, I love that point.
I don't know. There's like a certain, I mean, like, what if we like went to like the logical extreme?
Well, the worker is barbarous in this case.
Yeah. So isn't there something like a little more barbarous about, like the mining done in Africa for like the precious minerals for our iPhones, as opposed to maybe like the mining involved, as opposed to like the mining involved for, say like just, chairs in the area. Right. It's like, okay, we need to like, mine for specific minerals for, simple chairs.
The difference there
chairs.
is disturbing. Yes.
There is something disturbing about the end product and the work involved in the juxtaposition there. Do you get what I mean?
Kind of. I always get what you guys mean. I just don't, I don't know if that's what he's saying. Like, it just seems like so vague. Like to me, it's like a perspective. Like he's not really saying much of substance in these claims. I mean, it kind of, you can make it map on to like an observation of yours, but I just like, I always have to like assume he means what was like most pleasing to like thought that came to my mind. That's kind of like how this entire paper goes, to be honest.
Okay, so
Which
then
makes
you're in my camp at this point then with this paper where
I
it's
think so, but yeah, like I just like all of these things. Like you can say like, do you agree with the following, and then you describe a scenario, and I'm like, yeah, like, what you're saying like, makes sense, but it's not entailed by anything that he said. He didn't connect like his previous idea with the current one. It's just kind of like statements thrown out, some of which are going to resonate, and a lot of which are going to resonate. In fact,
Yes,
you know,
that's an extremely valid point. But again, there is a way to really not have a kind of poverty of reading this, where it's just you're reading it. I'm not saying you're doing this, but I'm just saying
yeah,
like there is a way that you could read this where you're looking to falsify every claim and you're looking to see. And again,
yeah,
like I'm not saying that, but
yeah.
like I don't think that that's where I think I honestly this is one of the only texts where I think the richness of this is just seeing how it obtains in your circumstances.
I don't know.
Like
I wasn't as hot on it as you were. I'm not sure if I'm hotter or less hot on it than Adam is quite yet.
okay, let's move
But
to the next section
yeah, we can keep
because
going.
I wrote multiple times yes in all capitals for the next section. So he's going to talk about. I'll just going into the next page. He says up to now, we have considered the estrangement, the alienation of the worker, only from one aspect, i.e., his relationship to the products of his labor. But estrangement manifests itself not only in the result, but also in the act of production within the activity of production itself. So he is going to talk about the act of production, estranging someone from themselves. So, you know, because he's already talked about this one type of estrangement where you're creating something that has no relation to you and you don't manifest yourself in that thing whatsoever, right? Excuse me. And we already talked about how, none of you shows up in the product for most people, right? But he's actually going to get very, very much deeper here. He's pointing to the fact that you trim yourself down in the modern world to become this simplistic version of you that is it itself is a tool. So, okay, he asks at the beginning of the next section, what constitutes the alienation of labor? And he says, firstly, the fact that labor is external to the worker, i.e., does not belong to his essential being, that he therefore does not confirm himself in his work, but denies himself, feels miserable and not happy, does not develop free mental and physical energy, but mortifies his flesh and ruins his mind. Hence, the worker feels himself only when he is not working. When he is working, he does not feel himself. Its alien character is clearly demonstrated by the fact that as soon as no physical or other compulsion exists, it is shunned like the plague. I had yes in all capitals here and hearkening back to Bertrand Russell. I mean, you do not get to be yourself at all when you're working to again, various degrees, but it's because you yourself are actually a tool, right? And it's like, remember we defined work for Russell as something that you would not do if you were not monetarily compensated for it. If we bring that in to this, dude, 90 something percent of people would never touch, would never think about, would never do anything that they do for a job again if they were not getting paid for it. And that's pretty fucked up. It's actually, I think that we're really, really accustomed and just situated in reality, and we don't question how actually fucking crazy it is sometimes. But like, I don't know. There's like, it doesn't. It's like it doesn't even matter if I do it or if someone else does. There's no part of me that remains in the product. And I think in large part because of that, because there's no individuality to most work that goes on, no one would ever do it again if they weren't paid to. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Do you
with
guys
that.
ever sit back and think like, oh, that's actually kind of fucked?
Well, yeah, I do. I guess this is more of like a comment about what informed my perspective, but especially, given that Marx, was part, historian, I guess, sought to explain like the process. It's like, this is true. Like it says his labor is forced, right? I mean,
Yes.
that seems largely true. But I'm trying to think of like, even non-alien work or like non-alienated labor seems like forced in some degree if you're tying it to like, subsistence.
Yes.
It's like, yes, it is true. And like, if you can give me like the alternative Magic Land where that's not the case, it's like, okay, like that's fair. But if you're critiquing like the current system in light of reality or like, previous, like you got to give me a little more, I guess. It's like,
I disagree. I don't think you have to give any proposal in order to correctly diagnose an issue.
No, I wasn't making like that claim. I said it was more like informing my perspective about how much about it like mapped onto like my beliefs, I guess.
I also agree. I agree with Giffin there too, in the sense that I'm just kind of just spitballing right now, but I agree that it does seem to be actually kind of like a two-axis kind of like, or more like a four-quadrant sort of categorization here, where it's like, yes, you can imagine alienating work that you wouldn't do other than the fact that you're getting paid, right? I mean, it's like,
of course.
Even if you're doing it yourself, like you're getting the full object. Like if you're farming, if you're like a peasant and you like have a small plot of land and you're just
like
backbreaking labor for turnips. It's like turnips are my subsistence. Yeah, if you just gave them the same kind of choice that's being proposed here, no, you're not going to be breaking your back and your children's backs sowing turnips. Seeds.
And I'd have to imagine like there are, mechanical engineers, that even though they're, extremely alienated from their work, they might actually enjoy their jobs. Though.
I was gonna get to that.
So it's
yes, I was gonna get to that where it's like that to me is almost it's like the Nietzschean concept of the ressentiment, where it's like you actually turn and embrace the thing that's oppressing you, though. Like that is where, because here, like I've heard people say, I would still do this even if I wasn't getting paid to do it, about something that statement seems obscene to me and honestly horrifying. Like I'm using that word for a reason, like horrifying.
Yeah.
Like if you didn't have to do this for work, you would still do it. That is diagnostic of the fact that I think actually that circles back on itself and points to Marx's point that you're destroying yourself. Actually, it's like when you reach those golden years, that like honeypot of retirement, you're not even a person anymore in large part. Like there are people that I know who do not have hobbies, who do not have interests, who work and come home and they're exhausted and they just like, I mean, like, think about just like the average American. Like, dude, the average American probably puts in, more than an 8-hour day, an hour, a half hour, an hour commute each way. They come home, they're fucking exhausted. They just get some like microwave TV dinner and they just watch TV until they just pass out and do it all again the next day. All for what? Like, we even have that saying, like, you're living for the weekend. It's like, that should be like a horror gong. And like, people like, really? Because when the weekend comes, dude, you're fucking tired. Like, you have other shit to do around the house. Like, I don't know. I
think I agree with your point, and I agree with Marx's point that I do think the alienation does play a role in the unhappiness at work.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
It's just that they're not perfectly linked.
Oh, of course.
So you're right. Yeah. The vast majority of people go to work that they don't like, and the alienation of the work itself is a reason in that.
You're right that he's talking about that quadrant, and he doesn't make it clear that there are the other quadrants. It's just there's the vast minority of people.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. What do you think of that, Giffin? Do you think that's fair?
It sounded roughly fair, yeah. It is a problem that, or it is a factor that contributes to, these problems that we see. Yeah, totally fair.
He has the next quote. The result of all of this is that man, the worker, feels that he is acting freely only in his animal functions, eating, drinking, and procreating, or at most in his dwelling and adornment, while in his human functions, he is nothing more than animal. Dude, like people, there's this like Reddit that I've looked at a few times. It's like it's r slash I hate work. Anti-work. Thank you, Giffin.
It's been in the news.
Dude, people literally take a shit at their jobs just to be themselves for a second, like let down that veil, just breathe. Like, and that is not only something that Amazon workers do. I think honestly, anyone who's listening to this who has just like some run-of-the-mill office job can relate to the fact that, dude, people like just take a little longer of a shit to just relax. And that, I don't know, that
I've done that.
That's so fucked. Like that, again, the solution to this is not like to abolish private property or whatever, but I like, all I think is that he is, I don't know, like he's hitting something on the head here.
Yeah, I think maybe part of it is that you're fighting to maintain human functions.
Yes.
But I mean, I think the Amazon worker might just shut down and just maintain animal functions at that point.
Again, a way in which that middle realm is sinister and in ways that the lower ones aren't. Okay.
Giffin, do you maintain animal functions or human functions at work?
They're mutually exclusive. so it's one or the other. Like, no, I mean, again, like whenever we're discussing kind of these experiences, like I totally agree. Like I can't disagree about any of these points. I've done the thing where you kind of sit in the restroom a little bit longer just to like, eke out a little bit of a
breathing
moment.
Yes.
Yeah. A little bit of like a, hobby, just like kind of, proper, something that you had that caught your attention. You were like Googling something to learn something or checking like something you were interested in. Absolutely. 100%. And I agree about like the consequences, but I think that's kind of like where his scope was successful. And that's kind of like only where I thought it was successful in this paper is like, it is easy, especially if you're kind of in like the category of the audience, to map on some experience of something he says, but it's the series of things he says and their connections that aren't like 100% there with me.
Yeah. I mean, that is very clear. I don't know. I think there's even like a colloquial phrase like there's like the you at work and the you at home, or it's like, dude, that I think it is deeply disturbing how unreflective people are about that standard. Like that you literally trim down who you are to get the job, to maintain the job. It's like, what is all this for like those fleeting moments after you've come home, you've done the laundry, like they're just, necessities of life you have to do. Like that panicked moment where you realize you have an hour and 45 minutes left before bed, but you're exhausted to fit in life. It's like, dude, Jesus Christ. I mean, like, I don't know that I'm disturbed at the lack of disturbment or the level to which people are disturbed about that.
Yeah.
Like that's fair. That really, I mean, dude, I don't know. Like I don't know what the answer is, but like, and you know what? I think this is also, Marx doesn't talk about this at all, but I think there's another way in which people are alienated from their rational faculties or their reflective selves, where it's actually too painful for most people to realize or think about or accept that is their reality. And so people just kind of shut down considerations of that because it's too hard to change jobs or to actually find a fulfilling career. Because I don't know, like Adam, I've talked about this 1,000 times, but like, imagine just someone, we know people like this. You come out of college, you get your first job, you just start getting those like interesting corners of yourself shaved off a little bit. And it's not that anyone is actually shaving them off, but it's the fact that you don't use them. They're like a muscle. If you don't use that muscle, it atrophies. And people don't use sides of themselves in an office job or when they're loading trucks or driving trucks or whatever, right? And there's the idea that that muscle can survive until retirement, only being exercised in fleeting moments on the weekends, no, it's wrong. It doesn't work. Like,
Yeah,
no one...
yeah, I know. Yeah.
Dude, this is like this. Honestly, like this like it rung too true, but in a little bit of a cathartic way. I mean, given the hope that I will get accepted to a PhD program, like
tonight on all fronts.
Dude, I would be at like the depths of despair, given like especially the recency of reading this. But like, okay, do we want to? I had less thoughts about the next section, honestly. The estrangement from species or species estrangement.
Species being. This was. I had to Google this, and then I had to re-Google it.
I had to do a lot more interpretation on this.
Yeah.
And honestly,
I'm saying something.
Because I've already done a fair bit. Yeah. Okay. There's a very charitable reading, which I have already shown I am wont to do, where I think that he's making an interesting point here. And honestly, it connects with me a little bit less than the previous points. But again, that could just be because of my particulars, right? He says it's going to be hard to actually quote from a lot of this, but he says that man lives from nature, i.e. nature in his body, and he must maintain a continuing dialogue with it if he is not to die. So honestly, this kind of made me think of Brian, because I think Brian would be very amenable to this. Like, I was kind of trying to channel Brian, and I think he would say something like, okay, look, like, he would point out the fact that, okay, just consider that the vast majority of people are vitamin C deficient from lack of sun exposure or something, right? Like he would point out the fact that people never go outside. People never play pickup sports after they graduate college. You never go hiking or go camping. And when you do, it's like very artificial, right? People like go to the beach, but they'll stay in a hotel. Like they'll just sit on the sand with their eyes closed or like in a, with like tanning lotion on. Like everything is very artificial and alienated from who we are as creatures, right? I think Brian would say, like, okay, look, like you got to remember, you're still an animal, right? Like you don't even have a body, you are a body. like, and going on to page 6, I almost think he's kind of making Marx is an Aristotelian function point here, where it's like we're kind of, as the types of creatures we are naturally this thinking thing, this creative thing, or thing could be substitute for species there, right? And he's already talked about a lot of the ways in which alienation happens in those respects. But we're those things. But remember, like he said, we're also animals, right? Like we literally are animals. And I don't know. I mean, I think that he's kind of pointing to the fact that we, through specialization, again, I'm doing a lot of charitable bringing in from other sections here, but you do so little of your natural functions at this point that you are kind of alienating yourself from the type of creature you are. I don't know. That was my reading of it.
Yeah, I mean,
that was part of it. That was definitely part of it. That was like the first half of it.
Yes. I stopped off at the middle of page 6.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to get that part on the table. I mean, that seems like a fairly parsimonious reading of what he was saying.
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, it was also just kind of talking about just, like what differentiates us from mere animals as well. And
yes.
We kind of betray those things, like our creativity and our ability to produce is pretty much hindered. It's like, I think that I don't know exactly where he says this, but he said like, only are we truly producing in a human way when we're not, working at one of these jobs, right? So
yeah, I have a quote.
I really liked that point. It's like, oh, that is kind of when you're the whole you in a way. Not to be like essentialist about it, but yeah, go ahead, Giffin.
I was going to say, this is the bottom of page 5. This was a quote that I underlined. Basically, he was using the comparison of like a bee building like a nest. It says like they produce only their own immediate needs or those of their young. They produce only when immediate physical need compels them to do so. And then this is the important part. While man produces even when he is free from physical need and truly produces only in freedom from such need. Right? And like that seems like pretty fair. I think like the part that is kind of like difficult and it kind of invades the mind immediately whenever you're reading this is like it's very hard to imagine a world like in true freedom from that kind of need, right?
I wonder if it is that hard, actually. I mean, like, what?
I mean, to me, it's like sounds almost inconceivable.
It's not, well, it's maybe, are you saying like inconceivable, like at the societal level where everybody?
Yeah, well, that's okay, sure,
yeah. I mean,
yeah.
I don't know, like, what if people like?
What about like perfect AI? I mean, that isn't that kind of the promise of perfect AI?
I actually have no idea what you're talking about.
Well, I mean,
perfect artificial intelligence.
You're talking about like just like the cultivation of like crops and all performed by AI and just daily
such that no one has to do. But like, okay, just grant that that's a possibility because I don't see any scientific reason to believe it's not, right? So that seems like a fairly plausible, because you know what's funny? Actually, I don't remember who said this. It was some popular author, but the kind of fear-inducing issue at that point is what people are actually struck with fear at that scenario, which in a way that I think actually proves Marx's point. Like, people are so hollowed out from living in the world that we live in now that people don't know what they would do with themselves. Like, people don't know what they would do if they had 18, 20 hours a day where they could actually do whatever they wanted. Like, a microcosm of this is when you have a sudden day off, like a snow day back whenever, in COVID, pre-COVID times, whenever like a lot of people, even with office jobs, had to go into their office. Dude, I would hear, or you would hear of people where they're like, they actually expressed boredom with a free day, or like they didn't know kind of what they were going to do with themselves. Like you'll hear that phrase get thrown out. It's like, what? Like, what? There are at any given time. And I think this is because like we happen to be, or I'll just speak for myself. Like, I happen to be young still. I happen not to be as like ground down by that system yet. There are 1,000 things at any given time that I would like to be doing that I can't be doing right now. And the idea that it would induce fear to know that I didn't have to worry about the necessities or money, I cannot relate to that position, actually.
So the fear of that, no, like that seems absurd.
I think that's the majority of people above the age of 35, though.
I don't think, that's probably an exaggeration.
I put money on that. Above 50% of people. What if I make it 40? Dude, people don't know what to do when they
fear, actually. If the word is fear, then no. Like, there would maybe be some like uncertainty.
No. Would they admit it? No. But would they experience it? Yeah, dude. People. How often do people actually do in retirement what they've said they were going to do in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s? Almost never. Like, because it like proves Marx's point. Like, people just emerge from 50 years as a means to an end, just hollowed out, without hobbies, without energy, without zest for life anymore. And people just sit around waiting to die in retirement. A lot of the time, again, he's not making it like a whole claim here, but like a lot of the time, yeah.
I think there are a lot of people that do.
I think there's a good bit that do, but
it's hard to know. I mean, like I actually have to piss, but both my grandparents, I mean, like my mom's parents, I mean, right when they retired, they traveled to Japan.
They managed not to get hollowed out. Yeah.
Yeah. Then like my other
did they have jobs that they liked?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. They did.
Okay.
They did.
Do they own the means of production, or
Well, but again,
No.
it's not the quadrants. Remember, you could have
Yeah, so this would be, and
You're looking
honestly,
for a falsified
I
claim,
actually wouldn't call this alienating work either, because
does it matter if you say what they did?
no, they worked at a private school, so as the superintendent and art teacher, so it's not alienating work.
No,
and it's happy work. So there you go.
That would not be alienating.
I think that's
an
exception.
I think if you're
using Marx's definition.
Yeah, using Marx's definition, I don't think let's define what the product would be. So I think the product in that case would be the education that students receive and the outcomes that students have post
and even the effort you put into that is part of that too.
Yeah, so I think that's something that you directly put work into, and then you see the effect that it has. So I don't think, given Marx's definition, that'd be too alienating.
And there's a way in which it's obviously not alienating, because it's literally like a person-to-person interaction. Like, you're not dealing with a cog, or like you're not even actually dealing with a thing. Like, you're dealing with other minds, right? And then like I think it's obvious if you just scale it up to the point where like you're a professor designing your own course on something like that. That is the least alienating labor that exists, I think.
Yeah, because at that point you're not really receiving work per se. I think actually, you might actually be receiving a little more work as a professor in that case than you would be even an art teacher at a high school, right? Because as a professor, you might be doing research, right? But then they might come to you, the faculty, and say, hey, we need you to teach this course. You're like, okay, I've received this. It's a minimal amount of reception. You know what I mean? Like, you've been asked to teach a course, but then at that point you have to frame to design the course. But as an art teacher, you've simply been asked, you knew what you signed up to teach art, and you design your own curriculum to teach art. I don't think that's, I wouldn't read that as receiving work.
I agree.
Marx's definition.
I don't know. I kind of do view it as that, but
what wouldn't be alienated work then?
Well, I mean,
because it's easy to say everything's alienating, but like, what wouldn't be then?
Well, you would basically have to own, I mean, in his terminology, like the means of the production. So in this case, these examples, they're employed still, right, by an employer, and they own the means of production. So in the case of an unalienated work would be like the craftsman.
They kind of don't own the means of production, though. Like, they actually don't own your ability to teach. And they can't take that from you, actually. And they can't.
Well, they can't take, your ability to strike a hammer if you're in a factory either, right?
No, they actually can.
Piss real fast.
Okay. I think they can, in the sense that is something that is look, if you teach, you have a certain pedagogy, right? And if I swap you out with someone else, it's going to be similar in maybe even more ways than not to how you would teach, or maybe even what you would teach, getting up to like some upper level courses or whatever. But this is actually a point that I was going to talk about, but it's germane to this. Like, the very reason why intrusion of using robots or using algorithms to replace people is because people aren't actually at the locus of importance in many, many jobs, right? So if you strike a nail you're on a production line, you just pound a nail in and then move on. A robot can do that trivially easy and much better than you can, right?
Sure.
A robot cannot teach in that same way. Like we're actually running into that real issues with online learning and everything. I mean, everyone thought Moogs or Coursera's were going to be like, the big thing and right? But even we're even finding that online learning doesn't even work as good as in-person learning. So there's a way in which actually like it might be kind of a quick and dirty heuristic to how alienating your work is, the extent to which your job can be automated, right? And I think a teacher position is incredibly immune to that.
I mean, here's the thing. I mean, is it less alienating? I would say yes.
I don't think Adam said it's not alienating at all.
Well, you at least use the term immune from, like just now.
Largely so I think immune from.
I think it's less alienating, but I still think would be subject to his concern.
Which career specifically?
The art teacher, yeah.
Oh, are you arguing, Giffin, that the school puts out, like, I'm just gonna, it's like hypothetical, but the school puts out a notice saying we have work for an art teacher.
Sure.
And at that point, someone says, I can teach art.
Yeah.
So they at that point have received work from the school to teach art. So in that framework. So I think I get what you're going for there. I guess the issue with that is, like, and I know you're just kind of you're saying this is what Marx would argue, under his framework. But it's like, under that framework, as Jordan was just saying, like a professor, it's like, okay, a university could say, we are looking for someone to do biochemical research.
Sure.
Broadly, right? Someone who has done a PhD and postdoc, and someone could come along and receive that work, quote unquote. Mm-hmm. But it's like, I almost feel like that framework doesn't work as well there. It's just it's like a weird framework you can apply there.
Yeah, the object of the labor is very hard to describe in cases of teaching.
There's also a huge difference in the fact that I actually think that, like, accepting the job is the less important aspect of receiving of work, as opposed to what happens, how you acquire work once you're in the job, right? Like, if you're lecturing and answering students' questions and you're having this organic interaction, you are not receiving work in the same way or to the same degree that you are if you're opening up a laptop and you get an email that's like, do this by this date.
Yeah. Organize the spreadsheets that you've organized daily for the last 10 years, right? No, I don't disagree with that.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, Marx explicitly kind of ties the entire idea of estrangement as being straightforwardly brought on through our current system involving private property. So, I mean, really subject to those, like, if you're in like a system that has private property, really, like, he's going to say to some extent, your labor is estranged.
That
was only my point, is like, it's all of these examples, like, there's more and less alienating and there's more and less, desirable outside of the framework of alienation, but it's all subject here.
Can I move on further down on page 6 to dude, this point? I actually thought about this for a minute, and it was deeply disturbing to me. He says, this is almost bottom of page 6, man's estrangement, like all relationships of man to himself, is realized and expressed only in a man's relationship to other men. In the relationship of estranged labor, each man, therefore, regards the other in accordance with the standard and the situation in which he, as a worker, finds himself. Dude, this was like deeply disturbing to me, because this actually harkens back to the conflict as property paper. And I thought this one, Niels Christie, I thought this was one of his best points, where he points out that we are so specialized and isolated in today's society that we view people not actually as people, but like as the roles they fill in society. And Marx is pointing to the same issue, where you actually see people, even your fellow workers, as their work roles, as commodities in that way. I just thought that part put me in like a very reflective state of mind. And also he just points out how it puts you in an adversarial relationship with your coworkers, right? Like when people are at a job and they're just collecting a paycheck and they're succumbing to all of these issues like alienation, they're just doing it, the Bertrand Russell definition of work, that, you wouldn't be doing this if it were not for pay, right? You're just like, you're using people as a means to an end. You're just trying to get out of that day alive, essentially, in a lot of the cases. And it's just like, how can I use people as a tool to get out of these situations? And it's obviously not that explicit always, but he points out, I think he does a really good job of indicating how the incentive structures, really just break down in that way. I think we're getting to the less interesting aspects in my mind. I mean, if you guys disagree, but the one last point I wanted to bring up was, the kind of the last concept of alienation, where he says, let us now go on to see how the concept of estranged, alienated labor must express and present itself in reality. If the product of labor is alien to me and confronts me as an alien power, to whom does it belong then? To a being other than me. Who is this being, he asks. So he goes on to say, and I'll summarize him, he's kind of saying it belongs to everyone, but really no one. Because he says, just as he creates his own production as a loss of reality, a punishment, and his own product as a loss, a product which does not belong to him, so he creates the domination of the non-producer over production and its product. Just as he estranges himself from himself, his own activity, so he confers upon the stranger and activity which does not belong to him. And I read that as like, we're creating a vicious circle for ourselves, honestly. Like everyone is alienating themselves, both from themselves, from their labor, from the fruits of their labor. And doing that is a harm to themselves, obviously, but it's a harm to other people, because it's like, I don't know, Marx is almost like throwing his hands up and be like, why are any of us doing this? Like, we can actually just have way better lives. This is the Russell point. Like, it is an incentive problem. It's a first mover problem. The person who actually just acts like themselves at work is like, it's like, he's gone mad. Get the gun. It's like, why? It's like, we're all working 40, 50, 60 hours a week so that we can do X, and it's all incremental or instrumental, so that we can do Y, so that we can finally do something we like, right? We're all like, it's the Russell concept of work for work's sake. Like, this is supposed to improve our lives at some point, but when is that going to happen? Like, when are people just going to take 10% off the gas pedal and just be like, all right, let's just chill and maybe play ping pong at lunch or something? Like, take like an extra 15 minutes and play ping pong at lunch. Like, this is where this begins to be like where I was making that point at the very beginning, where I don't think that if you buy the problem or even the magnitude of the problem, that you have to buy his solution, because I don't, that private property should be abolished and everything, right? Like that doesn't logically follow. At the very least, it's like, what would happen if we just backed off the gas pedal 10% and just tried to enjoy our lives a little bit more? I mean, what is the point if you never get to cash this check?
We'll be collectively enslaved by China.
That's just a global 10%. Incentive problem. You know what I
mean?
Yeah. But like, I don't know. That gets to the end of my real deep interest in this. If you guys had anything, I think from here on out, it's a little bit, he begins to turn into the upswing of his proposed solution a bit more. If we want to talk about that, we can. I'm just saying.
I think we can wrap it up here, but what I might want to do is we can maybe discuss his solution on our own a little bit, just like whenever we meet up or whatever. Because I having gone through like the first 8 pages now, I almost want to like tackle the last little bit on my own there. You know what I mean? And just see if I understand, because like I feel like I understand this better now, having gone through this.
And I'll add to that. It's plausible, and I think actually likely, that my lack of interest in the last 2 pages or 3 pages is due to my lack of understanding them in large part.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that I understood the last 2 or 3 pages.
I'm not sure I did entirely either. And that was for me, like the entire paper. Like I knew like the general.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, I got like the general concepts when reading through it. And obviously I knew where he was going, but like when I began to try to parse individual sentences, it became difficult. So, and I also think that us parsing individual sentences throughout this paper gave me a better understanding of what he was trying to go for. So I think it was productive, very productive.
Oh, yeah. I was going to say, I mean, from what I understand, I haven't read the Communist Manifesto, but from what I understand, it is sort of a more developed work than this and still fairly short to the point where we could just do it as an episode.
I think we have to read that next.
I think it would be improper not to.
Yeah, because
I think it would be.
It's only like 28 pages.
It's not long. Yeah.
And yeah, I would just want to hear a little more from him.
I agree.
Exactly. And it's not
something that was actually published.
Exactly.
Some fever dream writing.
Because like I didn't dislike this paper. It's just that I mean I think I did initially, but I think going through it collectively, I liked it more than. I thought there was a lot of sophistry, to be honest. I didn't like the reflexive quotes where it was just like, work is toil and toil is work. You know what I mean? Just like constant.
There's a bit of self-congratulatory nature to that.
Yeah, I didn't appreciate that writing style, and that was all.
No.
So.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I'm pretty much the same as where I was at first. Like everything that we would discuss separately, like. Don't you ever have this experience? It's like, yeah, of course. But this is like the paper itself.
Don't you think the way he framed it could illuminate? I mean, you would admit, right, that there could be circumstances that one could be placed in where you actually don't recognize that you're in that for lack of someone, even in a very inchoate way, as Marx does in this paper, gives you that bit of candle in the darkness to be like, oh shit, I'm actually curious if listeners have any of those experiences here where it's like, wow, that actually, I was experiencing that. But until I heard even this very primordial way of laying it out, I didn't realize that was the position I was in. Like, I think there's value to that, right? Even if he's not.
I mean, yeah, I think there's value, but I think the problem is it's the people who are reading it who are doing a lot of the work here.
Yes.
It's like,
yes.
You find something that roughly maps onto like, I mean, at a certain point, it's more like word recognition, right? It's like, concept mapping. You have to do like the whole work yourself.
All I'm saying is, I don't think if you look at this I don't know that I would say it's the proper light, but in a more generous light, like you would never say that about a Borges story, right? Where it's like Borges is clear. And again, obviously it's not a story. This is supposed to be like a critique, but I'm saying if you looked at a story with, is this always a Borges story? Like, is this always true? Is he like being clear about this? It's like, it's
no. Actually, I'm realizing when you're saying this, if we just kind of wrote down the stories that you guys gave as examples, that would be better than what we read here because it would illuminate exactly. It would be easier to map on. It wouldn't be confused by his 4-point of estrangement approach that
the
kind
Myers
of is self-contradictory
Marx.
and requires like Aristotelian like species being concepts.
The
like,
triple M man.
I'm not even like I think I do believe that it would be better just to have a list of experiences and say like, don't you experience some of this and isn't it like concerning?
I disagree with that. I think that if you had the best quotes from Marx and then examples and say this is how it manifests in the present day, that would be the best version of this.
Oh, no, I mean that would be the best, but it would be better than the paper we have here to just list the experiences.
And it's also kind of
maybe with the title "Estranged Labor" still that would be.
Also, to be fair to Giffin's point, like we did kind of skip around. I mean, Jordan, you kind of like directed us like you'd be like, okay, here are 2 paragraphs on page 4 that I liked. And we read those 2 paragraphs. And then while we were going through those, I read some of the other ones. And I'm like, oh, yeah, this one was a load of nonsense.
Yeah.
Like there were some of them that were really just like,
yes,
the ones
first
we
couple
focused
pages
on had a lot of good framing about, just estranged labor, which I think that framing itself is new to me. Right. And it's a good framing. And a lot of the points he brings up are good. But there was a lot of chaff in this paper.
Oh, yeah. So, I thought this will be my last thing I'll say. I actually thought there could be a better version of this paper where, and Giffin, I don't think this will ring true for you because you didn't read some of the earlier stuff that we did. But Adam, you remember we did Death and the Absurd by Nagel?
Of course.
And Nagel has that very just classic style of writing where he merely presents a paradox in a way that you're pulled by both stems of the incompatible claim, and then he just leaves you with that paradox. I think there's almost a way in which Marx could have done that with this, right? Where he's saying, and it might have been a better paper where he would just say, okay, look, this is a problem in the world, this estrangement of labor and estrangement in all the ways that we talked about. Yet it's a paradox because we actually need the majority of people to have lives like this in order to have the level of comfort and security that we enjoy. Like, and just leave it at that paradox. I don't know, like that there is a way in which that could be an interesting paper too, instead of, and maybe we'll understand more about this when we do the next episode with the Communist Manifesto, but
I mean, whenever you premise something with like, you know, it could have been a better paper. Like I agreed before you said it. I knew you were going to present something like,
sure.
And I didn't read the paper you were referencing, but that sounds like a much better framing, just like presenting the things and leaving you with like the discomfort there. But I guess like part of the example you were giving about like the paradox of like, you know, the modern life and like the modern state of the workers. To me, I think like what is the thing that's kind of like resisting the interpretation is not necessarily a paradox. It's just a, you know, morbid trade-off, right?
Yeah. It would only be a paradox
thing is like,
if we couldn't escape it.
Right.
Which we may, I mean, you know.
Yeah. I mean, that's way outside the scope of this.
Yeah.
But yeah, overall, it's a contribution. I agree it's a contribution. I do like the language, some of the language, like the idea of estrangement from labor. That's good. The subcomponent of the species.
You'll deign to say contribution.
200 years later, Marx is vindicated on the podcast.
It's like
I think deign to validate his existence.
It could be a one-line wiki entry, but
this is close to me saying that it could have been a TikTok.
You sign off that this has been allowed to exist the past 200 years.
I sign off that there's a very useful framing.
Yeah.
I don't sign off for a lot of any of the chaff, and it's a lot of chaff.
And you really have to imagine, like, I mean, obviously, Marx wasn't the founder of communism. I mean, like that idea obviously preceded Marx, but it's like no one had framed labor in this way before. Quite like,
no.
You know, I think
it's a genius way to frame it.
Yeah. So situated in that time period, you know, it is quite, you know, revolutionary in that sense.
To use an apt word.
Yeah.
given the topic. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, at the very least, I think we've given listeners a bit of anti-Jordan Peterson fodder, right? I mean, having not
condensed down to just Peterson quotes and insults on TikTok.
You want to deign from me in return, Giffin? I'll deign to say that if you've listened to this episode, you may know more about Marx's original writing than Jordan Peterson. It's a may claim that I'll sign off to. But all right. Join us next time for what should be a discussion of the Communist Manifesto. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode of Plato's Cave. I always enjoy discussing topics with these two guys. So if you want to support the show in any way, you can do so simply by sharing it. I'm hoping to get this show out to more people. And so if you want to share it on Twitter or social media, that would really help me. You can also rate it on Apple Podcasts. Like this video if you're watching on YouTube, or subscribe via Apple Podcasts or an RSS feed. You can also discuss it on your own show and link back to my website, or you can connect me with recommended guests or topics to cover. You can get in contact with me at platoscavepodcast@gmail.com. Follow me on Twitter at Jordan_C_Myers. And I now have a website for my philosophy endeavors at jordanmyers.org. If you want to know a little bit more about me and my fellow co-hosts, as I said in the introduction, I'm a master's student in philosophy at the University of Houston. I did my undergrad at the University of Pittsburgh, where I studied mechanical engineering and philosophy. And now that I'm back at school, I'm hoping to more closely study moral responsibility, free will, ethics, epistemology, and moral psychology. Those are topics that I was introduced to and got really interested in my undergrad work. So Adam and Giffin accompanied me on this show, and Adam is one of my oldest friends. We actually met in kindergarten, and we've been interested in philosophical topics for as long as we can remember, and in a lot of ways it's been the basis of our friendship. Adam studied chemistry and biology at Cornell, and he is currently working at a law firm. And he's especially interested in moral responsibility as well, but also law, religion, and free will. Giffin is also one of my oldest friends, and we've been friends since elementary school as well. Giffin studied biology and economics at RPI, and now he works in human health research. He believes that there's very interesting overlap between both of his fields of study and philosophy, and he's particularly interested in exploring political philosophy. So this series was right up his alley. And with all of that information, again, I hope that you enjoyed this episode, and I hope that you get in contact with me or follow my work in any way that you deem reasonable to do. So with that, thank you for listening.